Imagine you're the leader of a country whose people have been nomads for millennia, then decided to sort of settle, then immediately got incorporated into Russia, then 40% of them perished even before figuring out what is Russia, and then the survivors spent 70 years as a Union Republic of the USSR. What do you do first after achieving independence? Don't answer that. You've already been thrown out of power by the people because you sucked. Doesn't matter how. In a democracy, the people are always right. And if you insist on disagreeing, you may not like the result. Some of your successors try to disagree with the people, and as a result, they now live in Belarus or Russia in permanent exile. That's the shortest version of modern Kyrgyz history for you. Let's explore.
Birge basıp salgında Caydar günüz yaz gününde cargıldap Yumuşak şamal bekmey malap sılasa Mayda şokum jet vurulup şargıldap
Hello everyone and welcome to the 10th featured installment of the Central Asia featured series. So in the previous episode I described how Kyrgyzstan is more or less functional random and touched upon how the country still is under construction both literally and figuratively, as its history is also under construction. I mentioned in the previous episode that one of the foundational myths is the tragedy of Irkun. I forgot to also mention the Epic of Manas, the longest epic in the world by number of verses at over 500,000. The Epic of Manas plays a similar role to Volsunga Saga in Scandinavia, the Baptism on the Savica in Slovenia, Os Lusíadas in Portugal, and Mioritza in Romania. I wish I could tell you more about it, but after visiting all of the bookstores in Bishkek, I was still empty-handed. Which is a shame since they promote it so aggressively, yet it's not available for purchase in any other language than Kyrgyz. Still, the reason I'm mentioning it is because Manas is likely the first national epic poem to become a reason of dispute in the UN Security Council. And to make things funnier, it wasn't even the Kyrgyz's fault. But before I delve into that controversy, let's start with the beginning, in this case, the fall of the USSR. As mentioned in previous episodes throughout this series, the USSR was facing multiple protests in nearly all Union republics. Kazakhstan may have been the first to experiment them in 1986 with the Zheltoksan, but by 1989, protesting against Moscow became more or less the norm throughout the USSR. Not to mention the rest of the so-called communist world, which by the end of 1989 more or less ceased to exist. So, in line with the mood for change of those times, protests broke out in Bishkek too in 1989, at the time still called Frunze. In 1989, students and professors started gathering in explicitly nationalistic protests. The topic? The fact that the Kyrgyz people were intentionally being kept out and actively driven out of the capital city to make room for Russians and other foreigners. Moscow had ordered authorities to provide housing for Mashketian Turks arriving from Uzbekistan, where there had been fierce ethnic clashes and many people had been displaced. The local communists didn't like that, but also didn't have the courage to protest themselves, so instead they took a gamble and more or less urged the students and others to come out in protest and demand land and housing be made available to all, not for free, mind you, but to at least be able to buy. Of course, there is still little to no footage from that because, well, this place was technologically backwards even when compared to other Soviet republics. The plan was to use the protests to extract concessions from Moscow. Well, it worked. Arguing that the protests risked turning into ethnic violence, the local apparatchiks got permission from Moscow to slowly abolish the propiska system. Now, the propiska system is a system that predated the USSR, though it had been brought here by the Soviet Union. The propiska system was started by Peter the Great to ensure that serfs stay in the fields where they belonged. It had died out by the end of the existence of the Russian Empire, but got reintroduced by Stalin, and de jure it remained in force all the way till 1991. De facto, however, its use got transformed gradually from the 1970s, and by mid-1980s, some Union republics had de facto abolished it. So did Kyrgyzstan, following the protests from the summer of 1989, protests which, again, were low-key called for by the local communist elite. Unfortunately for the local communist elite, but also for several thousands of Kyrgyz citizens, things were going to take a negative turn just a year later. You see, in June 1989, Kyrgyz SSR was one of the most Russified Union republics. Only 22% of the residents of the capital city were Kyrgyz. Nearly 50% were Russians, additional 15% were Ukrainians or other Slavs, and nearly 10% were Jews, the latter being a rather unique fact in the Soviet Union. Still, it was only the Jews that supported the Kyrgyz in their effort to reclaim their capital city and improve their living conditions. Not that it mattered. One thing led to another, and exactly 1 year later, the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks were killing each other in the Osh region. The conflict started from an attempt to implement the agreed-upon reforms, which, among other things, allowed for repurposing the collective farms for housing development. The Uzbek minority in Osh interpreted that as an attempt by the Kyrgyz majority to remove them. Officially, 186 people were killed in the conflict. In reality, that number has been revised multiple times. The consensus now is that the first Osh massacre had at least 1,200 casualties, not to mention the multiple instances of torture, rape, beatings, and other horror stories. So, in a way, the threat that the local commies used in Moscow to get more autonomy, the threat of ethnic violence, turned out to be true. On this background, the Kyrgyz democratic movement was developing and already had members in the Supreme Soviet. Among other things, that Supreme Soviet from 1990 was also the one that would vote to dissolve itself. But until that happened, just 3 months after this massacre, the first nominally non-communist leader emerges. This guy, Akayev. He was voted by the Supreme Soviet, which also voted to no longer be called the Supreme Soviet and also dropped the name Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. Mr. Akayev was the first one to try to become supreme leader, a la Karimov in Uzbekistan, thus starting the cycle that continues to this day. New guy comes in, tries to become supreme leader, gets thrown out by violent public protest, gets exiled or jailed, new guy comes in, gets thrown out, and so on and so forth, as you will see in the following hour or so. Anyway, Mr. Akayev was a weird character for his time. A doctor in physics with an honors degree in mathematics, engineering, and computer science. And a communist. Sort of. In an interview given 2 months after being sworn into office, he said, quote, "Although I'm a communist, my basic attitude toward private property is favorable. I believe that the revolution in the sphere of economics was not made by Karl Marx, but by Adam Smith." Unquote. Funny chap at first. So, under Akayev, reconciliation and reform start. Privatization is kicked off, liberalization of the economy is allowed to happen, old communist state structures are dismantled, and the new state is smaller and filled with younger and reformist figures, many of them previously unknown and many of them open anti-communists. Seeing that others are seceding from the Soviet Union, Mr. Akayev puts it up to a referendum in March of 1991. Achieve full independence or preserve the Soviet Union as a renewed federation of states. But surprise, surprise, more than 88% of the people vote to preserve the Soviet Union. Definitely not the result anyone expected, though to be fair, the result was entirely predictable. Not only was Kyrgyzstan one of the most Russified Union republic, but, as I was explaining in the previous episode, Kyrgyzstan is one of the few, if not the only, ex-Soviet country where even the staunch anti-communists say that Russian influence was, overall, a good thing. This is definitely not obvious today, and we'll discuss a lot about that in the next episode, but it was very obvious in 1990. You see, nearly everything of relevance in Kyrgyzstan was either built by the Russians or by people from other Soviet republics, usually Ukraine or Belarus. Nearly all specialists were Russian or Ukrainian. So from that perspective, the vote made sense. To this day, the Kyrgyz people are very open to foreigners because, generally speaking, they've had few reasons not to after 1970 or so. And in 1990, the Kyrgyz were afraid that if the Soviet Union would collapse, nearly all specialists would leave, which would definitely harm the country. And they were right, though the referendum was ignored, also for good reason. During the coup d'etat attempt in Moscow in August of 1991, the emergency committee that had seized power temporarily in Moscow attempted to remove all reformist leaders, including Akayev. In return, Mr. Akayev made the bold move to ignore the Kyrgyz referendum and resigned from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union alongside with the entire bureau and secretariat. By the end of that month, the Supreme Soviet in Bishkek voted to no longer be a Supreme Soviet, proclaimed the Kyrgyz Republic as a sovereign state, and began preparations for the first round of free elections ever in Kyrgyz history, which were going to take place in October 1991. Mr. Akayev ran more or less unopposed, getting 95% of the vote, a score that nobody will ever get again in Kyrgyzstan. That's for sure. Now, today, Mr. Akayev's legacy is very controversial, and we will get into that soon, but it needs to be said, Mr. Akayev had a tough job in his first 2 terms. Remember, he was elected in October 1991, sworn into office in November 91, and in May 92, civil war broke out in neighboring Tajikistan. And as I was saying in the previous episode, all of the specialists predicted that Kyrgyzstan will devolve into civil war, rampant inflation, unimaginable corruption around the country's natural resources, and crippling poverty. Well, all of that did happen in Tajikistan. And Mr. Akayev had to try to not only avoid the same thing happening in Kyrgyzstan, but also to manage the flow of problems stemming from the civil war next door. To make things worse, the situation went haywire in Uzbekistan as well, with the Fergana incidents that I talked about in the episodes concerning Uzbekistan. Those ones were to spawn multiple terrorist movements and leaders that would plague the region way into the 21st century. So, less than a year into his first term, Mr. Akayev had economic reforms to push through while his country was neighboring a country in full-blown civil war, which would last for years, another country on the verge of civil war, that would be Uzbekistan, and was in the same neighborhood with Afghanistan, which at the time was seeing the first rise of the Taliban to power. Tough context for sure.
Ay salam Kyrgyzstan. Ay salam Kyrgyzstan.
Ironically, it was precisely this tough context that helped. Fearing they'd trigger another massacre, the new political class was fearful of meddling into the private affairs of the people, which created a de facto capitalist state, definitely more liberal than anyone in the region, a situation that continues to this day, albeit with some twists and turns. Besides, it's not like the new administration didn't have work to do, such as, getting the rest of the planet to formally recognize Kyrgyzstan, getting their story out in all of the international and multilateral forums, and all sorts of other diplomacy-related work, including convincing foreign investors to show up. Oh, on that point. Remember when I said earlier that the people were afraid that the specialists would flee if the USSR ceased to exist? Well, that turned out to be entirely true. It was a combination between general comfort and stability and the Soviet rules that kept the foreign specialists in the country. Once those were no longer in place, every foreigner with a skill could choose to move somewhere else where they'd get better pay. And that's exactly the choice they made. The absolute number is not known, but at least 2/3 of the foreigners fled by the summer of 1992. This was a nightmare for the newly liberated country. How do you run an economy on the brink of the 21st century without specialists and while being surrounded by a civil war in the making, a full-blown civil war, Afghanistan nearby, and you having border disputes with all of your neighbors? Well, the answer turned out to be economic liberalism, diplomacy, patience, and tobacco. Lots and lots of tobacco, in fact. In smoke-filled rooms, the new administration worked to settle some of the border disputes. They succeeded with Kazakhstan, which was arguably the most important one at the time. Then they worked to get UN assistance, mostly specialized assistance rather than financial. Of course, these efforts also brought in some scandals. Osman Akun Ibrahimov writes in his book about how discussions with Uzbekistan broke down and stayed frozen on the border issue for years because of a mistake concerning the interpretation of Manas. That scandal, however, also brought the first moment of re-evaluating national myths and slowly purging Soviet mythology from them. Ibrahimov, in the General History of the Kyrgyz State, quote, "Who would have thought that we, the titled academicians and professors, would encourage the biggest lie gleaned from the revelations of tabloids and pseudoscientific hacks, and it would be exposed not by a domestic scientist, not by some highbrow academician, but by the president of a neighboring country, that is, Islam Abduganievich Karimov. Not a philologist by any means, but an engineer by training." But I'll start from the very beginning, in order. In 1994, the UN General Assembly finally listened to our subtle voice from the depths of Central Asia and adopted a resolution on the worldwide celebration of the 1000th anniversary of the Epic of Manas. Yes, we tried hard, and in time we turned to the UN with a proposal to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of our heroic, tragic epic Manas, carefully justifying, arguing, and describing in detail the very long history of the issue. Of course, we were also lucky. Against the backdrop of common love for us, a very young Asian republic that has firmly chosen the course of democratic reforms, as well as the unanimous support of the member countries of the Security Council and a number of influential figures in world politics and culture, this would be the most authoritative. An international organization adopted a resolution to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of the Kyrgyz epic on a global scale. This was a huge foreign policy success for the country. Our neighbors didn't even hide their envy. But when we managed to push through a resolution at the same UN on the 2200th anniversary of Kyrgyz statehood in 2002 and the International Year of Mountains in 2003, this white envy greatly changed its color, and this also needs to be recognized. Thus, we were given a unique opportunity to declare ourselves to the world as a nation with an ancient culture and history and deep spirituality. On an intranational level, the 1000th anniversary of the epic played a powerful consolidating role, contributed to a general spiritual uplift, national state self-identification, and served as a fertile ideological foundation and support during the period of socio-economic and political transition. Now, Manas has become a banner in the hands of brainless populist nationalists who never realized the essence of the great epic, but back then Manas was perceived by everyone as an integrator and progenitor, a symbol of universal unity, as a national idea in a period of difficult state formation. The solemn anniversary meeting was in progress. In the large hall of the National Philharmonic, there were so many guests from abroad, from the UN and 7 presidents of countries, including the Director General of UNESCO, and other eminent guests sat on the podium. President Akayev held a speech on Manas and, as always, intelligently and scientifically substantiated, but at one point during the speech, breaking away from the text and apparently wanting to enliven the whole and at the same time prove the internationalism of Manas the Magnanimous, he said that the wife of the legendary Kyrgyz hero was from Bukhara and therefore the daughter of the Tajik people. It was meant that ethnic Tajiks traditionally lived and still do live in Bukhara. Sitting nearby, I immediately noticed that the president of Uzbekistan clearly did not like this. And everyone was well aware that there had always been a certain tension between Islam Karimov and Emomali Rakhmonov due to the civil war in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan's position on this issue. The Kyrgyz president finished his speech, other presidents and heads of state delegations began speaking, the floor was given then to the head of Uzbekistan, and a real scandal broke out. Islam Abduganievich, putting aside his prepared statement, directly addressed Akayev and began to speak simultaneously in Uzbek and Russian. Askar Akayevich, how did Manas Kankey's wife suddenly turn out to be Tajik? And on what basis do you claim this? For she was a real daughter of the Uzbek people, the daughter of the Bukhara Khanate. Tell me, when was a Tajik Khan of Bukhara? And here we go. Quote, I'll tell you more. All the Kyrgyz legendary heroes loved to marry our girls so much that the wife of Manas's closest associate named Almanbet was also an Uzbek. Close quote. The hall was buzzing. Karimov, having finished his speech very emotionally, approached Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan at the time, and left the hall with him. And so, almost until the end of the meeting, Karimov did not return, although Nursultan Abishevich still took his place and spoke. What's clear is that the Uzbek president flew back on the same day, citing some important matters, without taking part in the celebrations in Talas, on the land of Manas. The incident was not pleasant. Indeed, there is no evidence that the legendary Kanikei, the heavenly dark-skinned beauty, is a Tajik woman who spoke one of the dialects of the Persian language. And then, where did this pseudoscientific tale come from, which is still in wide circulation today, by the way? The history of the issue is as follows. At the end of the 70s of the last century, the days of the Kyrgyz SSR were held in still Soviet Tajikistan. And at the grand opening of the days in Dushanbe, Mirzo Tursunzadeh, an outstanding Tajik poet and public figure who is also a great master of social jokes, various hoaxes, and luxurious compliments, enlivened the hall with two really pleasant things. Addressing Chingiz Aitmatov, an incredibly popular writer and friend of his at the time, Mirzo Tursunzadeh said that the history of mankind knows two Chingizes. One of them conquered the world with his sword, and the other with his pen. Not surprisingly, the hall exploded with applause. But an even greater thunder of applause broke out when Mirzo Tursunzadeh said the following, quote, Everyone knows that the Kyrgyz epic Manas is one of the greatest and most voluminous, but not everyone knows the nationality of the beloved wife of the hero. So she comes from Bukhara. And who lives in Bukhara? Tajiks. So Manas Kanikey's wife is a real Tajik, and I want the brotherly Kyrgyz people to always know about these. These are the ties, dear comrades, that bind us Tajiks to our Kyrgyz brothers. The hall was buzzing, there was joy in the eyes of our compatriots, everyone was applauding in unison, and the Kyrgyz television repeated this episode again and again and again, and many, I hope, will remember this. That's where this story came from, and from there, it traveled around the world. It was repeated several times when the first Kyrgyz president made an official visit to Tajikistan in the second half of the 90s. It was on the lips when inter-Tajik negotiations were held in Bishkek under the leadership of Sherim Kulov, the best speaker of the country and an excellent diplomat, and the civil war in the neighboring country was stopped. This is unanimously repeated to this day by our Tajik friends. Of course, this story in itself is very pleasant. It especially plays it to the hands of politicians who do not care about science. They just want to get applause, please their counterparts, the public, etc. Therefore, of course, one should not strictly ask them about the interpretation of epics, unquote. Now, with the risk of having a long video, I introduced this long quote to also show how many decisions that impacted the lives of millions in the region were made on the spur of the moment for reasons that have very little to do with geopolitics or economics. Hundreds of thousands of Uzbeks and Kyrgyz people couldn't seamlessly travel to each other's country for several years because the president has exaggerated a little bit one or two verses from the epic story that's allegedly 1,000 years old. I mean, who cares what ethnicity Manas's wife was? If anything, the notion of Uzbek definitely didn't exist 1,000 years ago, as we demonstrated in the previous episodes. Who cares? Well, Islam Karimov cared, who also happened to be a dictator of the energy exporter in the region and with whom Kyrgyzstan had a border dispute. If you look closely on the map, being able to seamlessly cross the border between these three countries is crucial for the very survival of nearly everyone living in the Fergana Valley. And yet, because someone misquoted a playful hoax from the 1970s about a centuries-old text, everyone's lives in the region got suddenly turned upside down for several years. Welcome to Geopolitics. This, by the way, is not exclusive to Central Asia. Relationships between the United States and Saudi Arabia work very similarly, or the relations between Germany and Qatar. Personal relationships make the world go around. Now sure, this dispute was eventually solved, but it's a testament on how bad things can happen for very mundane reasons. Knowing these things should also help you not to fall into conspiracy theories. In reality, as we keep saying here on Freedom Alternative, most leaders are regular people with plenty of shortcomings, huge ego and poor temper being the most common. Oftentimes, what seems like an elaborate geopolitical plot or gamble is really just someone offended the wrong snowflake with the wrong joke. Anyway, all in all, things went well for the first 2 terms of Mr. Akayev. The country developed better and faster than even the most optimistic analyst could have predicted given the circumstances. But the most important lesson was only going to be learned after the year 2000. The most important lesson being that politicians are like socks. They're good to have around, but you need to change them often. Mr. Akayev disagreed, so he got himself re-elected in the year 2000 on a third 5-year term. And from then on, trouble started. For himself too, not just for the Kyrgyz people. By 2002, he was being openly contested everywhere he went, especially after he tried to send an opposition MP to jail on trumped-up corruption and abuse of power charges. During the protests against the prosecution of that MP, Mr. Akayev's forces committed abuse of power. In March of 2002, over 2,000 demonstrators marched in Jalalabad, where the trial of the MP was to take place. According to eyewitnesses, police ordered the demonstrators to stop and gave them 15 minutes to disperse, yet opened fire before this time had elapsed. 5 men were shot dead, another was killed on the next day. 61 people in total were injured, 47 police officers and 14 civilians. Because that's how protests work in Kyrgyzstan. Regime's foot soldiers don't have an easy life. Then the riot police clashed with protesters in Bishkek again in May the same year during demonstrations in support of the same MP. Police in the capital's parliament square kicked protesters and dragged people away to break up the 200-strong crowd. They made several demands, including the demand for Akayev to resign. This was again repeated in November, when scores were arrested as the opposition marched on the capital. Protests then continued on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, pretty much uninterrupted for the next 3 years. Kinda like the Shalket movement in Kazakhstan, except the Kyrgyz didn't wait for 10 years to get their desired result. By 2005, Mr. Akayev had promised he would step down at the end of his term. That was just after the parliament had proclaimed him immune from prosecution. Let's just say that nobody believed him. Especially not after in the 2005 parliamentary elections, 2 of his children ran for seats and surprisingly won, even though nobody knew anyone who voted for them. One thing led to another, and thus came the Second Kyrgyz Revolution. Dubbed the Tulip Revolution by the media, the things were simple. The plebs started slowly physically occupying all of the seats of power, and as usual, the trouble started in Osh. This is a recurring theme in the post-communist history of Kyrgyzstan. Before you know it, the protesters were controlling the southern part of the country and had one demand: the resignation of President Akayev. The government said it was willing to negotiate with the protesters, but the protesters were unrelenting. They only wanted to see the president in person and for one thing and one thing only. So he signs his resignation in front of them. Anything less than that was unacceptable. The president refused, but also pledged not to use force, fearing that this is a provocation by foreign powers. Hint, it wasn't. One day later, the interior minister is dismissed, but before Mr. Akayev could think of what he'd do, the protests had reached his doorstep. Literally. On March the 24th, 2005, protesters stormed the presidential compound in the central square of Bishkek and seized control of the seat of state power. At that moment, more than 90% of the country and 100% of the relevant seats of power were physically controlled by the opposition movement. And thus came the first exile. Mr. Akayev hopped into a plane and off he went. Where? To Russia, of course. Mr. Putin granted him asylum, and he now works as professor and senior researcher of Prigozhin Institute for Mathematical Investigation of Complex Systems at Moscow State University. He returned to Kyrgyzstan briefly only 16 years later, and only to be interviewed by the public prosecutor in connection to some shady business. He formally resigned from Russia in a letter retrieved by opposition leaders who traveled to Moscow to get it from him and avoid a constitutional crisis. But the revolution didn't quite end there. It also extended to physically persecuting members of Mr. Akayev's crony circle. 3 of the 75 members of parliament elected in March 2005 were assassinated, and another member was assassinated on May the 10th, 2006, shortly after winning his murdered brother's seat in a by-election. All 4 were known in the country for their involvement in major corruption and embezzlement scandals. Welcome to the National Directorate of Anti-Corruption, the Kyrgyz version.
Ай, салам, Кыргызстан. Ай, салам, Кыргызстан. Ай, салам, Кыргызстан. Ай, салам, Кыргызстан. Ай, салам, Кыргызстан.
After the Tulip Revolution, the Kyrgyz people started liking it, so they had more of them. The next one would come just 5 years later against the second president. This guy, Kurmanbek Bakiev. He was elected president to replace the exiled Akayev with a promise to limit presidential power, give more authority to parliament and the prime minister, and at least try to fight corruption and crime. You would think that knowing what happened to the previous guy, he would at least try to follow through some of the promises, but fun fact, politicians are the same everywhere, so of course he continued the looting. To make things worse, he tried to deepen relationships with China, something which was seen as a no-no in most of society, especially as China was slowly morphing into the dystopian nightmare that it is today. Friendly reminder, Kyrgyzstan neighbors Xinjiang, that place where the Chinese gulags reside. By 2009, he had evicted the US air base from Kyrgyzstan following a meeting with then-Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, during which Russia promised a $2 billion investment. Of course, shockingly, Russia didn't quite deliver. But hoping that this will work out, the voters re-elected him, albeit on a small margin. But when it became clear that Russia won't deliver, and when the administration tried to raise energy tariffs to please the second president's Chinese financiers, the population said, you know what, enough is enough. Riots broke out in April 2010, and by April 21st, Mr. Bakiev was holding press conferences from Minsk as an asylum seeker of Alexander Lukashenko. To this day, he is still in Belarus and can't exactly leave Belarus because in the meantime he was sentenced in absentia to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity for the killing of several protesters during the 2010 revolution. So, 2 presidents by 2010, both in exile abroad, physically removed from power by the people. By this time, it became clear to a lot more people in the political class that a Putin, Karimov, or even Nazarbayev leadership style is not acceptable here. So, after 2010, the political class tried slightly more seriously to govern in a more democratic fashion. So the third president was this lady, Rosa Otunbayeva, former foreign minister in the early 1990s and a career diplomat appreciated by nearly all political forces. Since she was serving as interim, by default she didn't hold much formal power. However, she used her influence to draw support for a new constitution which indeed limited the powers of the presidency, with the first order of business being that she herself can't run in the 2011 presidential elections. So, problem solved? Well, not quite. The regime of the first female president in Central Asia lasted less than 2 years but wasn't spared of being bloody. As with a recurring theme, during her term, yet another bloody ethnic clash occurred in the south of the country, starting from Osh. Really, it's quite surprising that this place never went full civil war, given how often things went south, both literally and figuratively. Pretty much everyone agrees today, including Otunbayeva herself, that security forces under her control were at fault for the ethnic clash and that the state committed violence against the Uzbek minority. But at the time, much to the shock even of her supporters, she rejected the conclusions of both domestic and international inquiries. That pretty much ended her ambitions of ever being elected president anytime in the future. So, several prosecutions of opposition leaders later and multiple other state abuses under the command of this woman, the election is held and the fourth president is inaugurated. This guy, Almazbek Atambayev, a fervent critic of both Mrs. Otunbayeva and the first two presidents. Mr. Atambayev had been part of the opposition movement since at least 2005 and had been to nearly all protests since 2006 and until he was inaugurated president. Finally, the most radical opposition was now in power. How did he do? Well, the best by far. Not that he was a particularly great president, but not pissing everyone off all at once and actually leaving office at the end of the term goes a long way towards being seen as better. During his term, he also further reduced the power of the presidency, reduced the total number of years a president can serve to a single 6-year term, abolished the use of military courts, and, perhaps most controversially, introduced the biometric election system. This is controversial to this day. The promised benefit did materialize. There was not a single scandal of election fraud in the sense of people voting multiple times or voting in someone else's name since its introduction. But the downsides were never fully assessed. Still, given the Kyrgyz propensity to forcibly remove any policy or politician they don't like, it is safe to say that the biometric identification system for voting isn't controversial enough. Also, during his term, Kyrgyzstan was put on the mental map of European diplomacy, and the most serious breakthroughs were accomplished with Uzbekistan. With that said, during his term, relations with Belarus turned sour due to Lukashenko sheltering the fugitive ex-president. He also went into an argument with the government of the United Kingdom on the same grounds. Bakiev's son was living in London and was managing his father's money, which were mostly stolen from the Kyrgyz treasury. To quote President Atambayev, quote, "Is Britain hosting the kids of Gaddafi or Bashar al-Assad? Why are there double standards against Kyrgyzstan? Britain is saying, oh, we want to help you with democratic development. That's a lie. You're hosting a guy who robbed us. We could use that money to fund fair elections," unquote. And to be fair, he kinda had a point. Nevertheless, he observed the constitution, and following presidential elections in 2017, the new elected president was inaugurated. This guy, Sooronbay Jeenbekov. This was the first, and so far the only, peaceful transition of power in post-Soviet Central Asia that did not involve death or revolution. After all, the transition from Islam Karimov to Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan was also peaceful, but it was triggered by the dictator's death. Still, the ascendance to presidency of Mr. Jeenbekov would start the chain of events that would lead to the 2020 revolution. You see, Mr. Jeenbekov was dead set into succeeding where his predecessors failed, to establish a presidential system of power around himself in the mold of either Vladimir Putin or Nursultan Nazarbayev. You would think that knowing what happened to the previous two that tried would have told him it's probably not a good idea, but as usual, the temptation is higher than reason. Besides, who would defend the current status quo if he manages to put Mr. Atambayev in jail? He was a friend of Nazarbayev and personally offended that his predecessor dared to call the Kazakh dictator, well, a dictator. So in foreign relations, Mr. Jeenbekov tried to be more balanced. But it wasn't foreign relations that led to him not finishing his term, but domestic issues, specifically clan politics. You see, clan politics is tolerated in Kyrgyzstan as long as it's in the private sphere. Putting all of your relatives in key state positions, as it turns out, is not tolerated, especially when done so abrasively like Mr. Jeenbekov did. I mean, the guy replaced the chairman of the Constitutional Chamber with one of his brother's assistants because the chairman had dared to say that the previous president cannot be retroactively blamed for things because that's not how the law works in a democracy. It's things like these that really pissed people off. Still, he got his wish, and in August 2019, the police arrested the previous president. Well, after they tried to kill him, that is. If you remember, in the previous episode, I did mention that the president that inaugurated the monument to commemorate 100 years since the Great Exodus was subjected to multiple assassination attempts, most of them state-sponsored. And then came the pandemic, and here there were basically three things that really pissed people off. One was the shutdown of Dordoy. Dordoy is this place, the largest bazaar in Asia outside of China. This place is huge, never-ending really. It's the go-to place to supply about a dozen countries with stuff. And it's also the main source of income for tens of thousands of families. As you can see, it's crowded and crammed. So in the name of holy social distancing, this place was shut down, plunging more than 300,000 people straight into starvation. Then came the fact that the government intentionally treated people with drugs that they knew they don't work in order for several pharmaceutical companies directly linked to high-ranking officials to get rid of purchased drugs that turned out to be ineffective. Now, mind you, this happened in multiple countries, but Kyrgyzstan is one of the few places where there were severe consequences for doing so. And three, the final nail in the coffin of this guy's rule came in October 2020 during the parliamentary elections, which, you guessed it, were kinda rigged. Who knew? The techno-optimism of the previous administration didn't quite pan out. Yes, there weren't people voting multiple times anymore, but that didn't stop Mr. Zhenbekov's side from simply paying people to vote for him. And these three things really pissed people off, so one day after the election, it was once again revolution time. This time the people were more experienced, so the whole thing didn't drag on for days or weeks or months. In less than 48 hours, the protest movement had occupied all of the relevant seats of power, and the president went missing. From an unknown location, Mr. Zhenbekov mobilized the army and tried to crack down on the protests, but a week later he resigned in exchange for not being treated like the previous two guys. But the 2020 revolution was amazing from another perspective. In the heat of the events, protesters invaded the prison where predecessor Atambayev was being held, freed him from prison and wanted to install him as a president. He refused, so the protesters headed towards a building where other political prisoners were being held, released all of those, and asked Mr. Sadr Japarov, a national conservative who'd been persecuted by Mr. Zhenbekov, they asked this guy to be president, and he agreed. So long story short, snap presidential elections were held and Sadr Japarov was elected the new president in an election that everyone deemed free and fair, including the Russian observer and Mr. Zhenbekov himself. Kyrgyz democracy at work. Literally break into the prison, get your favorite politician out and install it into office of presidency. The fact that Mr. Japarov won fair and square is also proof enough that the protests were indeed representative of the national mood. So, we are now in 2024. Mr. Japarov has been president since January 2021. So, what's next? If you ask me, likely another revolution. While Mr. Japarov is not so brutal like his predecessor, he too sometimes engages in persecution of his political enemies, albeit in softer forms than the predecessors. But unlike those predecessors, Mr. Japarov's government has been trying really hard, and so far failing, to tax the population more. If he succeeds, we might see another revolution. You see, contrary to what you are being told by the mainstream media, crippling taxation like the one seen in Europe is really not the norm globally, and not the norm in Asia either. Also, excessive financial surveillance like in China and Europe is also not the norm globally or in the rest of Asia. Mr. Japarov's government has been trying a bit too hard to implement both. This won't end well. Best case scenario, his party gets voted out of office, but it could end pretty badly too, for the Kyrgyz have no qualms in taking down the leader they themselves installed into office. It's part of the national ethos. Osman Ibrahimov, in the general history of the Kyrgyz state, writes, quote, "We, the Kyrgyz, are a very contradictory people. I mean this to the fullest extent. This can be seen in many ways in our post-Soviet history. For example, in all processes and political events. We fall in love quickly, but we also quickly become disappointed. And we immediately begin to hate, forgetting all of the good things. We have such a black and white palette of assessments and a very short transition period between like and dislike. Take Akayev, the country's first president. He was once very loved. Then we were disappointed. Then we hated him fiercely. We forgot all of the positive things he did, remembering only the bad. Now more begin to feel sorry for him as they try to understand him, but the resentment for what he did incorrectly and thoughtlessly still outweighs everything. In general, our people want presidents to never make any mistake, to do everything only correctly, only good, and nothing else. We have such a straightforward, strict love for leaders, especially presidents. But our attitude towards Akayev will probably remain the same. Pity mixed with resentment, sometimes a very deep resentment. There will hardly be any love for him now. Meanwhile, we deserve love and respect in only one way: our death by our tragic fate. We love our cultural and political figures only through the prism of their death, preferably early. We love to honor Alikul Osmanov, Kasim Tenistanov, Sultan Ibrahimov, Midin Alibayev, Bulat Minjilkiev, and so on, because they passed away early, that is, on time. Of course, I'm exaggerating a little, but nevertheless, the situation is kinda like this. Akayev, the first president and the first fugitive, was whitewashed and significantly acquitted by a thief and murderer, Bakiev. A certain contribution to this matter was also made by Mrs. Otunbayeva, who is 100 times better than the previous president, the one whom she and her cronies forcibly imposed on us, whom she later left herself. Thanks, of course, to her for this, but the country could well have done without this destructive and tragic gift in the form of Bakiev, his thieving family, or families, and the rest of the criminal camarilla, as well as two revolutions that cost thousands of lives and multi-billion material damage to our already poor country, unquote. So yeah, don't tread on the Kyrgyz. No matter how popular you are, that can go away overnight. Sometimes literally. Now, I'll go more into the present-day situation in the next episode, but until then, it is worth noting that over time, the relatively positive consideration for Russia has eroded, more so among the people, but increasingly among the elite as well. And again, the elite has no incentive to move away, at least from lukewarm Russophilia. So in turn, everyone just waits to see if maybe they can get away with not being too vocal. It's a risky gamble, but it may work, provided that the populace continues to ignore foreign affairs, which they usually do, until they don't. In 2021, the mayor of Bishkek found himself forcibly removed from office by means of direct popular action for reasons of excessive coughing in ideograms. Excessive closeness between Bishkek town hall and the regional government in China led to way too many Chinese-style decorations and Chinese-style predatory businesses, which led to very Kyrgyz-style protests that ended it all. So the Kyrgyz people have a proven track record of imposing their will upon the elite if necessary, and while they generally ignore foreign relations, they sometimes have pretty strong opinions about those too. Still, one shouldn't expect too much change at once. Another thing that characterizes the modern Kyrgyz nation is very fierce pragmatism. Nearly all of the plebs I spoke with when taking these images, again in August 2022, were of the opinion that while Russia sucks, the CCP sucks a lot more. And Kyrgyzstan is a small enough and poor enough country to be unable to be much of a challenge. And it's not significantly different from elite opinion. Osman Akun Ibrahimov in April 2022, quote, "If Europe and America and some developed countries of Asia, led by fraternal Turkey, almost without hesitation took the side of the warring Ukraine, then the countries of Central Asia have the hardest time. Firstly, Russia, without exaggeration, is the main strategic ally and partner of all Central Asian countries. And then these countries don't have much of a choice. America and Europe are far from us. If the Russian Federation turns its back on us, there will be a takeover by China. This prospect does not appeal to anyone, and it is considered better to deal with a familiar Russian bear than to fall into the mouth of an insatiable Asian dragon. I perfectly understand the leaders of the Central Asian republics who in every possible way avoid a direct answer to the question whose side you're on, and are working with special care to formulate a position on this extremely sensitive issue. Truly not an easy task at all, and for our Kyrgyz leadership as well. Nevertheless, being the first to run towards and attach yourself to Putin's neck and kiss him, as in that legend about one of Jesus' disciples after the famous Last Supper, is also not a good look. We need to at least hold a pause, call on everyone for peace, and be neutral for as much as possible. Even supporting someone should be dignified rather than plebeian. Everyone understands perfectly well, including in Kyrgyzstan, that to be equal of Eritrea and North Korea, who voted at the UN in support of Russia's military actions, means not to respect oneself. It is correct that we were among those who abstained from voting. We have not yet recognized Crimea. Heck, even Belarus did not recognize Crimea. Let the issue settle, passions subside, then you can calmly return to it. And to unconditionally support aggression means losing the respect of the world around you and showing yourself as a moral zero. We shouldn't want our children to be ashamed of us adults and of the country." Unquote. So yeah, I'm quoting extensively from Mr. Ibrahimov, not only because he writes well in Russian, making it easy for me to read his work, but also because his analysis is well read and appreciated internally, including by the people who despise him. In other words, his voice matters and is representative to elite thinking. Ultimately, the post-communist history of Kyrgyzstan pretty much guarantees that the place will continue to be functional random for the foreseeable future because there simply is no other way this place continues to exist. Venera Jumatayeva, director of the Kyrgyz service of Radio Free Europe, was saying in 2010, 2 revolutions ago, that personal freedom is way too important for the Kyrgyz people and they'll trade anything and fight any governing structure to preserve it. Quote, "The Kyrgyz are officially Muslims, but Islam doesn't have a long history in our lives. For centuries, the Kyrgyz practiced their shamanistic beliefs and culture, only later mixing it with Islamic customs. They were nomads, moving from one place to another with their yurts, and this existence demanded a lot of courage. They didn't recognize any strict governing structures or ideologies. The most precious thing for them was their freedom." Unquote. So, if we are to take epigenetics seriously, these people are tough, with all the good and the bad that comes with it. And in the next episode, we'll discuss quite a bit about both as they manifest in the present. 2023 was a tough year, even without yet another revolution. But it was also a year of progress on old conflicts. But for now, I will stop here since this video is already quite long. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like this kind of stuff, consider making a donation. Every year or so, we go in the field in a new region. Once we're done with Central Asia, we head for Southeast Asia and then Latin America. And with all of that being said, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.
Allah
Все.